All right, let's dive into a question that's intrigued humankind forever. Like, what actually is life?
Ah, the age-old question.
You know it. And for this deep dive, our guide's none other than Nobel Prize winner Paul Nurse and his book, What is Life? 5 Great Ideas in Biology.
5 big ideas, huh?
He uses those to unpack this massive question, make it less philosophical and more like rooted in science.
I like that approach.
Right. And get this, we'll bump into some pretty unexpected characters along the way. Yeast, hiding between teeth,
Between teeth. Okay, that's new.
rebellious genes, and even like your breakfast egg.
My breakfast egg, as in a single giant cell.
You got it.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity. Let's get started.
Okay, so first thing first, cells.
The building blocks of life, right?
But think about it, it's wild how recently we even figured out the basics. Like, until the 17th century, we didn't even know bacteria existed.
Seriously?
Yeah, it took this curious guy, Leeuwenhoek, to look at scrapings from, get this, between his teeth under a
Yeah.
microscope.
Okay, now I'm really curious.
And boom, he revealed this whole world of tiny animalcules, what we now call bacteria.
Ah, so that's the teeth connection?
Exactly. So these tiny single-celled organisms, they're everywhere. But how did that lead to, like, the cell being the fundamental unit of life?
Well, it was a journey. It's kind of like you can't build a skyscraper without bricks, right? Cells are those bricks of life.
Makes sense.
Throughout the 1800s, scientists were seeing that plants, animals, they're all made up of these tiny compartments.
Right.
But the real breakthrough, when they realized cells aren't just building blocks, they're actually alive themselves.
So we're not just made of cells, it's that each cell is living its own life. Whoa.
Precisely. Cells grow, reproduce, maintain themselves, just like any other organism. That's the heart of cell theory.
Okay, break it down for me.
So cell theory, 3 big points. Cells are the basic unit of life. Every single one's alive. And new cells, they only come from cells that already exist.
No more spontaneous generation, huh?
Poof, gone. It was revolutionary.
So every cell comes from another cell, like this chain of microscopic generations. Mind-blowing. But you mentioned how different cells can be, like that egg example. One giant cell.
Right. Imagine those bacteria Leeuwenhoek found. You could fit like 3,000 of them across a millimeter.
Wow.
Compare that to an egg, one single giant cell. It's crazy, the diversity, even at that microscopic level.
And all these cells working together, that's what makes complex life.
Yeah.
From roots growing to us just functioning.
Yeah, it's a beautiful system.
It also makes you think about diseases differently. Like cancer, it's basically cells gone rogue, dividing out of control.
You got it. And speaking of passing traits down during reproduction, that brings us to, you guessed it, genes.
Genes. The instruction manuals of life. But didn't we just skip over, like, how DNA even became a part of genes?
You're right. We did jump ahead a bit. It all starts with this monk, Gregor Mendel.
A monk.
Yeah. Back in the mid-1800s, he was busy with his pea plants, meticulously tracking traits.
Like flower color, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Things like flower color and seed shape across generations. And his discovery, revolutionary.
Okay, I'm listening.
Inheritance doesn't work by blending. It's based on these distinct units, what we now call genes.
No more blending traits, huh? Explains why we don't always look like a perfect mix of our parents.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Mendel didn't actually know what these genes were physically.
Oh, so he knew they existed, but not what they look like.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. While Mendel was doing his pea thing, Charles Darwin was developing his theory of evolution.
2 giants of science working at the same time.
And get this, neither of them fully grasped what the other was doing. It took decades for those pieces to fit together.
Crazy. So how did we go from, like, these abstract units of inheritance to understanding the physical stuff that makes up genes?
Well, while all this was happening, cell research was booming too. Scientist named Walter Fleming, he observed these thread-like structures during cell division, called them threads.
We call them
Chromosomes. And guess what? They carry those units of inheritance, the genes.
Okay, chromosomes are the carriers. Makes sense. But what are chromosomes made of? That's the real mystery.
The million-dollar question. For a while, scientists thought it was proteins.
Proteins. Seems logical.
Right. But then, 1944, a scientist named Avery, groundbreaking experiment. He proved it was actually DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. That held the key.
DNA. Game changer. And then the famous double helix.
1953, Watson and Crick, with help from Rosalind Franklin, of course, they revealed this elegant structure. Imagine a twisted ladder.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The rungs, they're made of pairs of nucleotide bases, A, T, G, and C. and their order. That's what encodes the genetic information.
Like letters in a sentence.
Exactly.
So the DNA sentence tells the cell what to do, right? Like make pigments for eye color or proteins to fight off disease.
You got it.
But how do those instructions turn into action?
That's where the genetic code comes in. The DNA sequence, it gets read, translated into a different language, the language of proteins.
A whole other language within us.
Isn't it fascinating? Think of it like translating a book from English to, say, Mandarin.
So each gene is basically a blueprint for a specific protein. And those proteins, they're the workers doing the actual stuff in the cell.
Precisely, like Nurse talks about with the beta-globin gene.
Right, that one codes for a protein that carries oxygen in our blood.
Exactly. A relatively small gene with a huge impact.
And think about the Human Genome Project. 2003. They mapped all 3 billion DNA letters in the human genome.
Monumental.
It puts things in perspective. Today, sequencing a whole genome, a day or two? Back then, years. Okay, we've covered cells, genes. What's next in this journey of understanding life?
Well, think about the sheer variety of life on Earth. From, well, whatever creatures fascinate you to the complexity of the human brain. Next up, evolution by natural selection.
Evolution. Darwin, Galapagos Islands, finches. I know the basics, but Nurse had a fresh take on it, didn't he?
He did. He starts with his childhood, fascinated by beetles.
Okay, beetles.
And how that showed him just how mind-boggling biodiversity is. Then he asks this simple but powerful question. How did all this diversity come to be?
Good question. For ages, people use the watchmaker analogy, like life's so intricate it must have been designed, right?
Yeah, the idea of a grand designer. But then comes Darwin with this radical idea. Natural selection.
It's like nature's constantly experimenting, fine-tuning life over eons.
Exactly. And, Darwin wasn't the first to propose evolution. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was on board.
What, another Darwin?
He even wrote poems about it, caused a stir back then.
The original science poet. Okay, but what was so groundbreaking about Charles Darwin's take? Why him?
Darwin brought tons of evidence from his travels, his observations. He laid out the core principles of natural selection.
Give me the rundown.
Variation within a species, inheritance of those variations, and the idea that some individuals, they're just better suited to their environment.
Leading to?
Differential reproductive success.
Survival of the fittest. So like giraffes with longer necks, reaching those higher leaves, thriving, passing on those genes.
Exactly. It's this beautiful interplay. Chance, in the form of random variations, meets necessity, the pressure to survive in a specific environment.
It all comes down to adapting, huh?
You got it. And Darwin actually used, artificial selection as evidence for how this all works.
Wait, artificial selection?
Like dog breeding. Think about it. We've bred wolves and chihuahuas from the same ancestor.
Wow, yeah. That's some serious selective pressure. But how does this tie back to cells and genes?
Well, think about what's needed for evolution to even happen. You need reproduction, heredity, and variation.
Right, building blocks.
Cells provide the means for reproduction. Genes are those units of heredity, and those random mutations, they bring the variation, makes evolution possible.
It all connects. And whoa, the idea that all life on Earth shares a common ancestor. Mind-blowing.
It really is. Nurse tells this story about encountering mountain gorillas in the wild.
Okay, gorillas.
And realizing our deep connection to these primates. And in his research, he even found that a human gene could function perfectly in yeast.
We can swap genes between species. Amazing.
Yeah, but then he makes this sobering point. Cancer itself, it's evolution happening inside us.
Whoa, hadn't thought of it like that.
Cancer cells, with their uncontrolled growth, they're basically outcompeting healthy cells right within us. It shows evolution's a constant force.
A little scary, but also fascinating.
For sure. It's happening at every level of life. Okay, we've covered some ground. Tiny cells to vast evolutionary time.
Ooh, my brain's doing some evolving right now.
Yeah.
But there's more, right?
Oh, there's more. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll tackle the idea that life, at its core, is all about chemistry.
Chemistry. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Okay, chemistry. I gotta admit, when I think about how intricate life is, it's tempting to think, like, there's some magic involved.
Yeah, I get that. For centuries, people were all about vitalism, right? The idea that living things had this mysterious force, something beyond physics and chemistry.
Right, like a special life essence.
Yeah.
But Nurse argues against that, doesn't he?
He does. As we learn more about the chemistry of life, that vitalism idea kind of faded away. It became clear, no need for a mystical force.
So the processes of life, They can be explained by the same laws that govern everything else.
That's the idea. Same chemical and physical laws, no special treatment for living things.
Okay, so no magic needed. Just plain old chemistry.
Mm.
To illustrate this, Nurse uses a pretty relatable example, right?
He does. He talks about his time working at a brewery.
Brewery.
Yeah. And how that got him thinking about fermentation. Yeast turning sugar into alcohol.
Ah, the magic of yeast. I mean, the chemistry of yeast.
Right. And we've been using this process for ages, probably without even realizing how complex the biochemistry is.
Well, a good beer or wine does make you appreciate yeast, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But how did studying something like fermentation, something so everyday, help scientists understand life as chemistry?
It all goes back to scientists like Lavoisier and Pasteur.
Okay, I know Pasteur.
Yeah.
The pasteurization guy.
Yeah. Well, Lavoisier sadly met his end during the French Revolution,
Oh, wow.
but he was one of the first to realize, hey, fermentation's a chemical reaction. And then Pasteur comes along and shows that those tiny yeast cells, they're the ones driving the reaction.
So it wasn't some mysterious force, it was those little yeasts doing their chemistry thing?
Exactly. Pasteur had this great quote, chemical reactions are an expression of the life of the cell.
Love that.
And that idea that life's all about chemical reactions, it became central to biology.
Okay, so tons of chemical reactions in every cell.
Yeah.
But it's not just random chaos, right?
Right. There's order, organization, all those reactions together in an organism, that's metabolism.
Metabolism, got it.
Building up molecules, breaking them down, releasing energy, everything a cell needs to keep running.
Like a well-oiled chemical factory.
Yeah.
But how does a cell manage all that complexity?
Well, that's where enzymes come in. They're like the specialized workers in that factory.
Worker.
They're biological catalysts. They speed up reactions without being consumed themselves.
Okay, speed things up. But how?
Without enzymes, many of the reactions that are essential for life, they'd just be way too slow. Not enough to keep things running.
So enzymes, they're key to making this whole chemistry thing work. But what are they made of?
Remember those proteins we talked about?
Yeah.
Long chains of amino acids?
Yeah.
Most enzymes are proteins, and they fold into these crazy complex 3D structures. That's what gives them their specificity.
So each enzyme has a unique shape that allows it to do a specific job.
Precisely. It interacts with specific molecules, catalyzes specific reactions, like a key fitting into a lock.
So each enzyme is like a tiny custom-made tool. And Nurse talks about the sheer number of proteins in a cell, right?
He does. It's mind-boggling. He compares the protein count in a simple yeast cell to the population of Beijing.
Seriously, that many?
Millions and millions of proteins, each with its own job, all interacting in this crazy dynamic cellular environment.
It's a bustling city of molecules. Okay, so we've got all this activity, all these reactions. How does a cell keep things from descending into total chaos?
Compartmentalization. It's genius, really. Think about a city, right? You've got zones for different purposes.
Yeah, you don't want houses and factories all jumbled up together.
Exactly. Organization is key. And cells, they're masters of compartmentalization. It starts with the cell itself, separated from its environment by a membrane.
Right.
But then inside, you've got organelles, specialized compartments, each with its own set of functions.
So it's like compartments within compartments, each one creating the perfect environment for specific reactions to happen.
Precisely.
Nurse talks about some key organelles, right?
No.
The nucleus, mitochondria?
Yes. The nucleus, that's the control center. It houses the chromosomes, the DNA carriers,
Right.
and then you have the mitochondria, the powerhouses. They generate energy through cellular respiration.
Ah, turning food into energy.
Exactly. Converting that energy stored in food molecules into a form the cell can actually use.
And wasn't there something about mitochondria once being free-living bacteria?
You remember?
Yeah, vaguely.
It's amazing, right? Symbiosis. Two organisms living together, both benefiting.
They teamed up.
Exactly. And those once independent bacteria, they became essential parts of eukaryotic cells. The kind
Yeah.
of cells that make up plants and animals.
So compartments, enzymes, energy production.
Yeah.
It's incredible. But it feels like there's more to life than just these reactions, There's this element of information, of decision-making that's also essential.
Spot on. And that brings us to the next big idea. Life as information.
Life is information, huh? What does that even mean? It sounds kind of abstract.
It might sound abstract, but think about it this way. Even simple organisms, they're always gathering information about their surroundings.
Okay, so they're paying attention.
Exactly. And they use that information to make choices that affect their survival. Nurse uses a butterfly to illustrate this, remember?
Oh, yeah. He was watching a butterfly in his garden.
Right. Flitting around, dodging predators, finding food.
Not just random actions, right?
Yeah.
It's processing info, behaving with a purpose.
Exactly. And that sense of purpose, that's a big part of what makes something alive, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It's what sets living things apart from, like rocks.
Right. A rock just sits there. But a butterfly, a plant, a bacterium, they're all working to stay alive, to grow, to reproduce.
Driven to survive. And information's key to that. But where's all this information come from? How's it stored? How's it processed?
Well, DNA itself, that's a prime example of information storage and processing.
Okay, DNA, the instruction manual.
Think of genes like lines of code, instructions written in the four-letter language of DNA.
Just 4 letters.
A, T, G, and C. Simple system, but the combos, they create a massive amount of information.
And those instructions in the DNA, they get turned into action through transcription and translation, right?
You got it. DNA to RNA to protein. The central dogma.
Love that term.
But it's not just about the info in the DNA sequence. Cells are dynamic. They're constantly regulating which genes are on or off.
Based on what the cell needs at that moment.
Exactly. It's like having this huge library, but only checking out the books you need right now.
I like that analogy.
So every cell in our body has the same DNA, but different cells are using different parts of it. That's why a skin cell is different from a brain cell.
Totally different job.
And that ability to regulate gene expression, that's what lets organisms develop from a single fertilized egg, adapt to changes, even like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly.
Amazing transformations.
It is.
But how do cells make sense of all this information? How do they coordinate everything that's going on inside them?
Think of it as a complex network. Information's constantly flowing between different parts of the cell. Nurse uses the analogy of Watt's governor on a steam engine to explain how this works.
Right. The governor uses feedback to keep the engine's speed stable.
Exactly. A simple, elegant system.
And cells, they're way more complex than steam engines, but they use similar principles, right?
Feedback, regulation, all to maintain homeostasis.
That stable internal environment that's essential for life.
You got it.
So it's all about balance, even when the outside world's changing.
Yep. But it's not just about staying stable. Cells have to respond to change, adapt to new situations.
How do they do that?
Signaling pathways, molecular communication networks. Cells can send signals to each other, triggering all sorts of responses.
Okay, like what kinds of responses?
Turning on a gene, starting cell division, even programmed cell death.
Whoa, there's like a whole conversation happening.
Isn't it amazing? And cells don't just react in the moment, they also have a kind of memory.
A cellular memory.
They can remember past experiences, and that influences their future behavior. This is where epigenetics comes in.
Ah, epigenetics. That's a hot topic these days.
It is. It's an extra layer of information on top of the DNA sequence itself. Think of it like notes written in the margins of a book.
Okay, I can picture that.
These epigenetic marks, they affect which genes get expressed. And they can be passed down not just through cell divisions, but sometimes even across generations.
So what our experiences can actually change how our genes are expressed.
That's the idea.
Incredible. But hold on, there's another layer here. How do cells use information to create the physical structures of life? Organelles, tissues, whole organisms.
That's a big question. It's not just about the information itself. It's about how it's used to create like three-dimensional structures. Cells need spatial information, a sense of where they are.
So they have a kind of internal GPS system, a molecular map.
That's a great way to put it. But how do they get this spatial information? What signals are they following?
Yeah, what are they picking up on?
One way is chemical gradients. Imagine a drop of dye in water. You get this gradient, more concentrated in the center, less as you move out.
Right, I can picture that.
Cells can sense these gradients. They use them to orient themselves, like following a chemical trail.
It's like a map made of molecules.
Yeah.
And then there's the cell cycle, which nurses studied extensively. It's a great example of how information controls a fundamental process of life.
Absolutely. The cell cycle, how a cell copies its DNA and divides, it's super tightly regulated. Cells have to make sure they've grown enough, their DNA's okay, the environment's right, before they divide.
Lots of checks and balances.
It's crucial.
And that CDK complex, the one that's so important for the cell cycle, it's like a central hub, right? Integrating information, making decisions.
Exactly. Like a conductor, making sure the whole cellular orchestra is in sync.
Okay, so we've explored these 5 big ideas. The cell, the gene, evolution, life is chemistry, and life is information. So What's the answer? What is life, really?
It's the question, isn't it? It's what's driven scientists and philosophers for ages. But what really stands out, to me at least, is that life is incredibly complex and interconnected. It's this amazing symphony of chemistry and information, always evolving, adapting.
Makes you appreciate just how much is happening in each of our trillions of cells, all working together to keep us going.
It's humbling, isn't it? And inspiring.
Totally. Maybe next time we're, like, chopping veggies for dinner, we'll think about those cells buzzing with activity.
Millions of reactions every second, all guided by the information in their genes. A whole universe happening right there on the cutting board.
Until next time, keep exploring.